kwenzakalana empilweni yalombhali ezebhala this particular nkondlo, because umoya wombhali becomes important so that I can then be able to interpret imizwa ayikhiphela kulamakhasi awabhalayo. Okwesithathu, ukuba isibusiso ukuthi sibe namathuba okuphengululwa kwezibhalo, sithola ithuba lokuthi ngoba sihlangene lapha ngalempela sonto sithi creating an alternative community for all God's people. iBhayibheli lingasilekelela kanjani ukuthi sizame ukusondela nokucacisa umgomo ophambi kwethu siWesley yakule sekethe yaseBlue. Now, mina nawe sifunda iBhayibheli ngo-2025, 21st century. But iBhayibheli is born largely from the stories of the first century. Meaning, iBhayibheli isikhathi esibhalwe ngaso nesikhathi engilifunda ngaso, there will be a gap. Because life is no longer what it was in first century. Because the Bible comes from umhlaba wase Palestine and surrounding areas. Isikompilo labo alifani nesikompilo lethu singabantu bakule sekethe yaseBlue Downs. So at all times we try uma sifunda iBhayibheli noma senze iBible study ukuzama ukunciphisa umgama ophakathi kwami njengomuntu ofundayo ngo-2025 and travel to the first century. Because iBhayibheli udinga ukuthi uqale ulivumele lizikhulumele lona ngokomhlaba waka first century. Mase uthi ngoba selisikhulumele ke from the time uJesu wathetha lamazwi, isho ukuthini ke lento kuthina kubantu baka 2025? Siyamba kulo. Right. Singena kwivangeli libhalwa indoda ekuthiwa nguMateyu. uMateyu ungumJuda. uMateyu ukubhala kwakhe iBhayibheli okanye ukubhala kwakhe ibali likaYesu ulibhala from a place of being a Jew, and he wants to focus on what makes sense for his Jewishness. That is why mayiqala elakhe ivangeli uzoqala ngolibofuzo ukuthi uJesu uphumaphi, aqala ukuthi ubani wazala bani agcine velile ukuthi kwase kuba khona uJesu, because ufuna ukuthi alinke, make a case ethi amaJuda ayethembisiwe ukuthi endlini kaJese, endlini kaDavide kuyophuma uMesiya. That is why he then starts with the genealogy in chapter 1, because he wants to make sure that the prophecy that from the house of Jesse a Messiah shall come, that now this Jesus is born, must be received as the Messiah. Okwesibili okubalekile uma sifunda ivangeli likaMateyu, uqaphela ukuthi uMateyu uzothi kufika ingelosi ikhulume noMaria, uzokhulelwa, uthola umntwana, umbize ngegama elithi nguEmmanuel, okusho ukuthi God is with us till tonight. So Matthew, part of what he wants to tell a story, he wants to tell a different story than the story of the Old Testament. Angithi in the Old Testament, uthiwa uIsrayeli mayihambe nhlangu, uThixo will become intoni? Ifu la. Uba ifu nini? Uba kuthi umayihamba uba ifu day or night? During the day, and at night iqange lomlilo. Now the Old Testament iqange lomlilo namafu represents a God who is present but not really present. there is a difference, or there is a distance between uThixo oyiqange noThixo olilive. Because someone who says bhakabhakeni, this God is in the sky. But now Matthew tells a story that kwenzeka isimanga akasekho emafini, usevele wafika wahlala waba phakathi kwethu. Now you need to understand this, because if you miss that, then you will struggle to then relate with the story that Matthew tells. So God is no longer in the sky as a pillar of cloud and as the fire at night, but he is now with us. So now we get to host God. Suddenly God has an address. That is why you will find in the Bible saying, are you telling us that Lo Nyana Kayosef, the carpenter? Now God is no longer removed, but God is now has come to be a part of inhlalo yabantu. Ngamanye amazwi, the God that is Jesus, that Matthew introduces, is a God ongekaxoxelwe ukuthi kunzima kanjani ukuphila eBlue Downs, because he's with us. The experience yaseGalili, abantu abaphila ngaphansi kwayo, ingcindezi abaphila ngaphansi kwayo, ngeke exoxelwe uThixo, because he is also living in the same space, is subjected to the same problems. Akasadingi ukubalisela ukuthi amanzi aphelile, because uyabona ukuthi amanzi aphelile. So the greatest gift now is that if God is with us, then God is now has come and entered a space of a human experience. Hello? Yes. Now I want us to get this right. In the Old Testament, Moses will go and say, God, I want to see you face to face. And then God will say, no one sees my face and leave. And then he sees only what looks like the back of God. So all the time, Moses must go and say, God, abantu bakho abanakudla. Then God will bring him man. But now Matthew says, sekwenzeke manje into enkulu kunale besiyibone kwiTestament endala. Usevele wafika uNkulunkulu wahlala phakathi kwethu. Ukushisa kwelanga sizokuzwa sonke. Ukucindezelwa kwabantu basePalestine angeke kubaliselwe, because he is also now has entered the human experience. Then now we have a Jesus who is God with us. There is nothing that God has done greater than a God who has come. Atu Johane in his Christology, ati waba inyama wahlala phakathi kwethu. Suddenly, ayiseki gap between umuntu noNkulunkulu, because uNkulunkulu has now entered the human realm, the human experience. Because it is important for us to have a God who has had a human experience, because he will understand and receive our prayers from a place where I know what it feels like. Because only God who has wept will be able to see and interpret my tears. Because this Jesus, when I say to him, he understands, because he once wept at Lazarus. A God who is with us, in the human experience. He understands, because God has entered the human experience. Now we are then told of this God who has entered the human experience. Matthew thought Jesus has come for the Jews only. But this God who is now with us, he says there are Xhosas, there are Zulus. Everyone deserves to have the presence of God who is with us. They wanted to domesticate God for them only. But God says, I belong not to one particular people, but I belong to all. That is why we listen to the story, chapter 16. Where is the story taking place? In the city of Philippi, Caesarea Philippi, the Xhosa Bible tells us. So where is Caesarea Philippi? This is not a Jewish land. So the story does not take place in the Jewish land, but the story takes place in the land of the Gentile. Remember, in ministry ka Jesu all the time iphakathi komhlaba wamaJuda nomhlaba wabantu ethiwa abezizwe, the Gentiles. So all the time Jesus will move between the Jewish territory and the Gentile territory. It matters was with this story. If you read anybody Bible, where does the story takes place? Because that will give you context, and context gives you meaning. So if the story takes place in the city of Philippi, Caesarea, kumhlaba wabezizwe, they are in a city yezizwe nenhlanga. It's a cosmopolitan community. Kukhona abantu abanqula othixo bambi. One of the gods abanqulwayo apha Caesarea Philippi is a god that was called Pan, P-A-N, like a frying pan. So there is a god called the Pan. And anyone else says they are God because we believe lezizwe nenhlanga. Akuyena isi umhlaba kaSirayeli lo kunqulwa khona uYahweh. But here kunqula umuntu into ayithandayo. In this city of Philippi, kulezizwe nenhlanga of many religions. Imagine, unamaSulumane, there is amaJuda, they are Greeks, they are Methodists, they are Anglicans, there is everything and it's a catalog of religion in this particular place, Yasef Philippi. Then it is in this context, yezizwe nenhlanga, umhlaba wezizwe nenhlanga, that Jesus then now asks a question. Ubuza bani abafundi bakhe? Akabuzi izizwe nenhlanga lezi. Uthi abantu bathi ngingubani? Bapha abantu. Abantu bala ezizizwe nenhlanga. In this cosmopolitan space, who do people say that I am? In other words, Jesus is trying to gauge ukuthi izizwe nenhlanga sezizwile yini ukuthi usefikile umkhululi. Jesus is trying to get a sense ukuthi sebezwile yini ukuthi uEmmanuel usekhona. Jesus is trying to get a sense ukuthi uma sebezwile ngami basahleli na kothixo bami. Who do people say that I am? Do they know who now they no longer have to be having all these little demigods and false gods? They can just choose one God and be sorted for life. And he asked the question, but abantu bengingubani? And then bayaphendula ke abafundi. Hayi abantu bathi wena ungumprofeti, abanye bathi wena unguJohane umbhaphatisi. He listens, and uJesu is somewhat disappointed. Matthew doesn't say it's my own inference. That somewhat Jesus is disappointed ukuthi abantu balapha in the city of Philippi abangazi. They have a mistaken identity of who I am. Angiyena uJohane mina umbhaphatisi. I'm even greater than John the Baptizer. Now when Jesus says, scanned information through the first question, abantu bathi ngingubani, he then turns around and asks a question, Nina, nithi ngingubani. So now Jesus is saying, there is this community ezizwe nenhlanga. But I want to create an alternative community. But the alternative community will be dependent on the two questions and the answers that come. Ngifuna ukwakha a different community than the one that the city of Philippi lives. But the city of Philippi does not know me. So I need to see at a small scale, Nina ngihamba nani, do you know who I am? So that from the little I have, then I can use laba bambalwa to become an alternative community that will influence the city of Philippi. So Jesus is saying, if nizothola impendulo eyiqiniso ukuthi ngingubani kunina nibambala, then I'm not worried about the city of Philippi that doesn't know me, because it is the few of you, the 12 of you, that will now go and tell the city of Philippi the truth about who Jesus is. Abantu abala endlini bambalwa compared to abantu abalapha elokishini. But then Jesus is saying, the alternative community will not come from outside into, but we can only blame that guy. So Jesus is saying, in this alternative community esikuyo, it will take a few guilders abakholelwayo ukuthi ubani uJesu that will begin to influence the masses that are outside and say kubantu abangaphandle there is an alternative lifestyle. Ujola, as we were driving in, kunale ndawo phaya ekhoneni kwaSathane. So Jesus uthi ngiyazi ukuthi in this community there are places ezibizwa ngamagama that speaks of the evil of darkness and lifelessness. Na yonke into ebhedayo kuthiwa kwaSathane. And Jesus is saying, but there is a few that I want to ask them a question. Who do you say that I am, so that I can trust the few that is gathered in this church? Kube yona that will begin to go kwaSathane and say, why do you have to leave kwaSathane when there is the Emmanuel, the God with us? Then Peter pendule, mabebuza ukuthi nina nithi ngubani? To Peter, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Now this is where the story gets interesting. You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And then at that moment, kushintwa igama lika Petros from being known as Simon to now being Peter. And this Peter now means, the name Peter means what? Huh? What does Peter mean? Angezwa. Peter means rock.
No.
That's fine. Let's move. Now we get confused here, because now there is a new name, and this new name kuthiwa Peter, the rock. Then after this Peter guy, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Then Jesus quickly moves and say, awuchilelwanga inyama lento ethethayo, uchilelwe ngamazulu, and upon this rock I will build my church. You know where we go? We then say, Jesus is saying, upon Peter he will build the church. And that is not what Jesus is saying. Because Jesus has no interest of going back to the old tradition of making religion the work and institution of man. So now, remember, Israel has a history of building churches and temples and institutions. Kodwa these institutions zakhiwe ngabantu, zaba isisekelo kuDavide, uSolomon, and so on and so forth. And Jesus now has no interest of building a church on a mere mortal. So Jesus is not going to build a church upon Peter. But Jesus is saying, upon this rock. What rock? Your confession of saying, you are the Messiah. So the church, the alternative community, will be built not on Peter, not on Senzo, not on Umdingi, not on Ukumalo, not on any man or women for that matter, but it will be built kubufakazi. Your testimony, your confession, yokuthi who is Jesus? Come on, Gilders. Come on, Gilders. Listen. The confession lenkolo ayenzayo yabapostile uPetros yokuthi wena you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus says, upon that rock. Kulamazwi owashoyo ukuthi ngingubani ayiqiniso ngoba abantu abangazi ukuthi ngingubani bathi nginguJohane uMbhaphatisi bathi ngingumprofeti, but when we akwazi ukuthi ngingubani, that I'm the Messiah, I'm the anointed one. In other words, Jesus is saying people who will become an alternative community are people abazokuzicela ngomlomo wabo ukuthi who is Jesus for you? If you do not know and confess who Jesus is, then there is no rock to build Blue Downs Circuit Wesley Guild upon. You will gather here because it is easy to gather. We all wear the same uniform and stuff like that. But there is no rock. No sihlangene just for verbs. Just for content. But they need to be in an alternative community. This rock. The rock yokwazi ukuthi uJesu ngubani. Confess Jesus as the Lord and Savior, the Messiah. Kube isisekelo that the church will then be built on. Why does Peter say Jesus is the Messiah? Messiah means the anointed one. So part of the responsibility of the Messiah is to bring peace. Now English yes ropa because it peace. Kanti ku first century abana gama elithi peace. Instead for them bakhuluma nge-shalom. So part of the responsibility of the Messiah is to usher and bring the shalom of God. Now the shalom of God is not just peace. What is peace? What is that? What do you understand to be the meaning of God or peace? Come on, anyone? It's not a trick question.
Absence of war.
Absence of war. Then we say in the absence of war, then there is peace. What else? Forgiveness. Okay? Now when we speak of peace, we'll speak of attributes like forgiveness, absence of war. And these are correct, but shalom is much bigger than the two. So the Messiah, part of what the Messiah must bring is shalom. So Peter is careful in how he coins the title of Jesus. He does not say you are the king. He does not say anything else, but he says you are the Messiah. If you are the Messiah, you are responsible to bring shalom. And what is shalom? Shalom, it means it is the absence of war. It is where people get along, there is forgiveness. But shalom goes further because ingumthandazo lento shalom. It goes to say, when the Jewish people greet each other shalom, they are saying, may your soil produce enough food for you and your children. When they greet each other and say shalom. But abantwana babo sengathi bengafunda bathola ama-degrees, bathi bathola ama-degrees bangabi iphathi ye-statistics yabantu abagraduatile bangasebenza. Sengathi abantwana bakho bengathola umsebenzi olingana nemfundo yabo. Shalom. When then Peter says, come on, when Peter says, you are the Messiah, you are responsible to bring the shalom. So the guild, yes, Blue Downs, it today, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Because bring the shalom that gives us decent land, decent home. Give us something better. Give us the shalom that was promised. About you are the Messiah. Peter's declaration. That is why then Jesus says, upon you saying shalom, upon you knowing that I will bring in shalom, upon that I will build the alternative community. Shalom. When they speak of the shalom, but sengathi kungonaphela ukudla. Engathi your bread tin will always have food, or rather will always have bread. When they speak of shalom, it is not just the absence of war, but you might find that there is no war. Because akukho amajoni ahambayo apha sidubulani njengasePalestine ne-Israel. Kodwa there is war of poverty, of hunger. There is war of unemployment. There is war against abantu abasha abatshumpantshumpheka in drugs. There is war in this country. So when we then say as the alternative community, phakathi Philippi, Peter does not say this in the presence of abantu bakokwabo amaJuda. He does not confess Jesus as the Messiah phakathi kweGilda zesibhelevu, phakathi kothixo bami of the city of Philippi. He then says, ngiyababona bonke labo thixo abalapha kule dolophu, kodwa wena nguwe uMessiah. I see the streets are calling. Angeke we say that. Hey, mfundisi sheshisa ba. The streets are calling. You know, sifuna ukuya lezi ndawo esenza khona le ithombe ezithu. Yabo lezi ithombe ezithu. On drinks.
Umare.
Kulate ngoku. Sifuna ukuya kumaphumare. Winter is gone. The sun is beginning to shine, and suddenly the mood here is good. It's in about December. In the midst of yonke ubunewunewu baseFilippi, then Peter uyama uthi no. Angibafuni othixo baseFilippi nobunewunewu baseFilippi, mina ngaziwena, the Messiah, the one who will usher the shalom. One of the things I love is music. I listen to music at every chance I get. And I listen to all sorts. Influenced, Jola, by Professor James Cole on how he uses music as a methodology of doing theology. Uzola 7 has an intro kula CD yomdlwele uthi kuyoze kube nini umuntu omnyama ethi kuzolu uthi ngiphuma endlini ngathi mangihamba ngahlangana nomama ugqoka izingubo zaseZion ngathi oledi kunjani wathi Zola ekhaya akukho kudla kodwa ke kulungile akukho next ngabloma namajita estratini athi amajita Zola asispana ispana sikho kodwa ke fede akukho next. He tells this in about a minute of the different situations of a community similar to Blue Downs. And then he says, everyone ends and say, akukho next. Then he asks a question. Kuyoze benini umuntu omnyama ethi kuzoluka ethi akukho next. We have no land, we have no jobs, we have no dignity. We were told the university degree, but our degrees are gathering dust, we're sweeping the streets if we are lucky. Come on. That is why that confession of Peter becomes important, because Peter is saying to Jesus, if you are the Messiah, if I say you are the Messiah, therefore you need to live and lead a life of a Messiah. If you are the Messiah, then maskhululwe nguwe ke kumakhamandela, because the Messiah has a responsibility to bring shalom. I am taking you at your word, amandla ngawakho, and I'm reminding you that you are the Messiah, so that when I come to you and I say I am not just talking to the God of the Philippi, but I'm speaking to a God who is the Messiah, the God of the shalom. God of shalom, andina kudla. Make a plan. I demand it, because you are the Messiah. The alternative community is not going to be built on the Constitution of the Wesley Guild. It's not going to be built on a laws and discipline. You know what? An alternative community, Jola, sorry, it's not going to be built by many conferences every year we go to and synods that we go to. But that alternative community is the Segelo Sayo. It is the confession of remembering that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Sibe Segelo from where the church is built. If it's Segelo Singeko, but we've got all kinds of documents and all kinds of statements and all kinds of sermons and all kinds of things, kodwa asiki Segelo, where the church, that rock from where the church will be built. So dear Blue Downs, Wesley Guild, find yourself that rock. Find yourself that rock. Don't build on sand, but build on that rock. And that rock, it is the confession of who Jesus is. You know the pledge of the Wesley Guild by heart. But how many verses do you know by heart? I'm sorry. Isn't this useless? Jeremiah, what you call it? One heart, one way. Where does it come from? Jeremiah chapter? Verses? Okay, 38, 39. Okay. Do you know what is happening in that story? You see, that's a problem. We know where one heart, one way comes from. We can reference the scripture. But ask us to read and analyze what is happening in that story. So that when we speak of one heart, one way, isisegelo is solid. Now we have recitations without the conviction of the heart. There is no rock. I'm not even going to be tempted to go there. But the point is this, that Peter makes. You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus declares this to be a foundation. Not a foundation that will become an exclusive club, but a foundation that will become an alternative community that will begin to attract others. And this alternative community grows from being Abandabai 12 to being 24, to being a 48, to being 100, to become a movement that sweeps the Blue Downs community into a new wave, that there is a man called God is with us. So if Jesus is the Messiah, and Matthew has said at Kaleni, he is God with us. So we don't just have a Messiah that is living somewhere, but we have a Messiah that understands the human experience. So why are we still left sisokole. Yes, systematic, no doubt. But part of ukusokola kwethu, it's because we have not taken Jesus at his word of who he is. Because we have no relationship. The rock, our faith is not built on the rock. Our faith is built on singabantu becawa, but we are not the people of Jesus. In the city of Philippi, Peter declares Jesus to be the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Can we get all of us here that in the city of Philippi, called Blue Downs, that we can go and tell a story of everyone else going on with their business, chasing God knows what, that we can just confess Jesus as the rock, as the Messiah, as the one who ushers the shalom of God. What is the difference between mina nabantu abablome lapha kwaSathane? The difference is not meant for us to judge that community, but on how do we become an attractive community, an attractive lifestyle that makes them to say, why should I risk my life by being out there when I can be able to be in a safe haven called the Wesley Guild, called the church, the body of Christ? That's the rock that the alternative community is built on it. And that is my story. I pause just to check if there are questions, comments before I conclude.